I've been really looking forward to the next session because it focuses on people, right? It's indigenous communities and culture in the Arctic. What are the expectations and needs of people who live there now? It's their place. What conflicts and challenges come with more development and more intense relationships with the world beyond the Arctic? What is the say of indigenous people in all these grand policy issues that we've been placing on the table here? Now, opening the conversation will be Professor Michael Bravo from the University of Cambridge. He has an introduction to indigenous communities of the Arctic and their engagement with each other and with non-indigenous people. He'll discuss their stake in how the Arctic region is transformed and what it'll mean to Arctic residents and other countries outside the region to try to pursue new opportunities that paradoxically come with climate change, some of which we've been engaging earlier today. Central to our afternoon, we'll hear from leaders of two indigenous communities, Sarah Alsvig from the Inuit community of Greenland, and Gun-Britt Redder, who is from the Sami community of Norway. Both these indigenous communities have members distributed across the Arctic region. But let's begin our look at indigenous communities with Michael Bravo and a discussion called Community and Governance in a Fractured World. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, and thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be on the panel with two real experts, such distinguished and experienced leaders from Greenland and from Sapmi. You see, I thought it would be useful just to start with a slide that shows the extraordinary diversity of the Arctic. It makes the first point that the Arctic is inhabited, which sometimes gets forgotten. So that's the key point. But look at the range of languages, and the map just gives you a survey, a bird's eye view of the extraordinary range of languages and indeed of indigenous peoples in the Arctic. I understand that in Alaska alone, there are 230 roughly tribal peoples recognized in one way or another. So this is a special region with extraordinary cultural diversity that is at the heart of the character of the Arctic region. Okay, thanks for the slide. My role in this is a bit peculiar, speaking alongside two experienced Northern leaders, because they are a tough act to follow and even more difficult than to precede them. Look, they're the real experts. And I'm neither Indigenous nor a policymaker. My role here today is as an educator. So earlier in the colloquium, we were asked the question, which I think should keep coming up, about what gives us a sense of hope besides the gloom and doom associated with the real facts of the climate emergency. And I wanted to think about this today, this year in particular, because it is a dramatic year, a year of the climate emergency, also a year of the COVID pandemic, and perhaps equally important politically as the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, to do research in the Arctic, really at the heart of it is partnerships, economic partnerships, cultural partnerships with Northern peoples and other Northern citizens. And that means listening. Research is about not just about professing, as professors are supposed to do, but about listening. And I think that increasingly means sharing the creation of research agendas so that we also try and solve the problems that are chosen by people living in the Arctic. So what I want to do today is develop with you to think about a dialogue that takes place between those people who are outside the Arctic and those who are in the Arctic. As outsiders, we might look at the Arctic or in the Arctic with great curiosity in the hope of hearing how people in the Arctic not only see their own world, the circumpolar north, but also how they also see the rest of the world. Okay? And that can be done through partnerships in education. And hence, for 20 or 30 years or longer, the dominant ethical approach to research in the Arctic has been collaborative. And I think that is essential for reasons that actually have geopolitical implications. So I'm glad to have worked at different times with the University of Greenland of Elisabeth Tustarvik, the Arctic University of Norway, Centers for Sami Studies, Nunavut Arctic College, Aurora College, University of Alaska, various indigenous arts producers. So not only is this region populated, but it's one that has strong voices and strong institutions of education. Now, partnerships are built on what? They're built on trust. They also implicitly depend on some notion of community, which is the theme of our session, or one of the themes. Community brings people together, however diverse the people are, with common goals. And this is as true in global climate talks and economic development as it is, say, in circumpolar governance. So community is a big deal. And we mustn't make the mistake of trying to understand Arctic communities as though they're kind of these distant, remote, sparsely populated settlements, because that's a tiny part of the story. Well, why not? Both because it misunderstands the notion of community, but also urbanization is a really important factor in the Arctic. Many northern indigenous peoples live in cities. You might live in Iqaluit, in Anchorage, in Nuuk, in Arkhangelsk. Moreover, many indigenous people, let's not forget, also live further south, beneath the Arctic Circle. They're very significant indigenous communities, Inuit communities in Ottawa and Montreal, Greenlandic communities in Copenhagen. And these cities, they really matter because they're part of the global network through which northern leaders and citizens reach out to and are connected to the rest of the world. Okay, and interestingly, of course, those major cities are not necessarily highlighted in most maps of where northern peoples live. So much is said about the Arctic as a region founded on cooperation. And I suppose there are good reasons for celebrating international cooperation. That's what makes the intergovernmental organization, the Arctic Council, probably unique in some respects in the globe. But cooperation is predicated on the notion of a coherent community, on some notion of cohesion. But as the title of my talk suggests, it's also a case that a sense of community, I think, is fractured. I mean, there are differences within the Arctic, economic differences, considerable inequalities across the Arctic within states, between different states as well as within states. And it's also true that the 8 Arctic states have not always been keen on ceding power and investing in northern regions and peoples, sometimes happier to take the credit for it than to do the hard work. So the next point really about community is that community is geopolitics. So I've noticed over many years of research that if one starts to talk about culture, sometimes in these discussions, students will recognize this. You do your politics course over in one classroom, but then you do your cultural studies in another department. I want to argue that the two are actually closely related, that community is geopolitics. If that's not obvious to you, then I want to suggest that the pandemic has probably made that more clear than ever before. Just think about health. Just think about vaccines. The human body is constantly the topic of the news, and the community spirits, as well as the fracturing of communities, is also at the heart of public health. And indeed, it's undeniable, surely, that it is the subject of geopolitics over the past year in particular. So while we are rightly told that climate and the the physical processes of the Earth are a major driver in the Arctic, in understanding the Arctic. So too is community and governance. Last year at the Arctic Assembly, the Arctic Circle Assembly, Secretary Kerry made a really important and fascinating point, I thought, which was he said, yeah, we can find the science to solve the climate emergency. There are technologies that if they're not developed yet, we have the confidence that could be. But he said perhaps the most lacking thing, perhaps the riskiest part of how we meet the climate emergency is the problem of weak governance internationally. So here now we realize we need to think about community on different scales. The Arctic is an inhabited region, but also the Arctic is part of a global community, as President Grimson also alluded to. And to realize that one of the things that the Arctic brings the world is a delicate sense of moral authority. So when humanity works together, and when this is well illustrated through the Arctic Council and other international initiatives, particularly those of the permanent participants, that's the collective coming together of indigenous groups across national boundaries, then that's a good advertisement for the Arctic. Okay. However, what about a fractured Arctic? I mean, there are inequalities in the Arctic. And when these inequalities grow, and this is a really good year to have a look at this, then the whole regional cooperation becomes less effective, right? And potentially, one can continue to talk about the Arctic as a coherent region, I think, but in truth, the weaker the forces of cooperation, the greater the inequality, then the more the Arctic can begin to fragment into actually three regions, which are the North American Arctic of Canada and Alaska, Arctic Canada and Alaska, the Scandinavian Arctic, including Greenland, if I may, and then also what's being called by Mia Bennett, the Asian Arctic, that is the Arctic of Russia, China, and perhaps also Japan and Korea. So there's a geopolitics here and it's a shifting geopolitics as to how the Arctic sits in relation to the world. Already today, in thinking about the future scenarios, we've talked a little bit about trade and shipping, but our colleague who in the first session, Professor Majewski, also pointed out that it can be just as hard to know what's already happened as to what's going to happen. I just want to pick up on the phrase, the Northern Sea Route, or yes, it was often also called the Northeast Passage. So the Northeast Passage, of course, has its origins in the 16th century as part of the story of imperial trade routes in Europe. But actually, it's also been given another name recently, which is the Polar Silk Road. Now, I think the clue is in the name, Polar Silk Road. Both refers to a name that refers to the Silk Road that stretched from Cathay to Venice, from China to Europe, in right across Central Asia. And so it's become synonymous with the massive development, the Chinese investment in the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's also, by the way, it's older than the Northeast Passage. So there's a geopolitics at play in the very naming of the geography of the Arctic. And I think the point is, and some of you who are students will know this because I know you are already reading about the Arctic alongside the politics and the cultures of the third pole, of the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. So I look forward to hearing what my colleagues on the panel are going to say about their view of the greater world, the geopolitics of the world, because there's every reason to believe that the indigenous politics and culture of the Arctic is in some way going to resonate or have implications for the politics of other regions. And then to some extent, the question is how? Now, after all, experienced politicians of the indigenous Arctic are already very well acquainted with the new observer states through talks, through agreements, and they, I think, have noticed that new observer states are often very willing to be very respectful of indigenous societies and culture. So while we speculate a lot about the motives, say, of China and Japan in the Arctic, I think it's also worth thinking about how the Arctic fits into the geopolitical priorities of those countries and their interests in other regions. And it seems to me that being good governance in the Arctic, which is something that every country can aspire to, including the observer states, will have some consequence for the rest of the world. Just as an example, US policymakers have often said, and US politicians have often pointed out, that the Arctic is important, but is not that important when compared alongside geopolitical priorities in the Middle East, in the Far East, and so on. But perhaps that begins to change now in some way when the visibility and the voices of Northern people are heard right the way around the world, where the Arctic is increasingly interconnected with other regions. So I have a plea on which I kind of wish to conclude my talk, because I don't want to speak too long, which is, if it's the case that culture, the culture of the North and of Northern peoples is in fact of significant geopolitical significance, if it is the case that we do really need to think about the changing inequalities in the Arctic, by which I mean health inequalities, but also the growing digital divide between places that are really well connected by fiber optic and places where they struggle to get a signal for their phones. This is actually the infrastructure which underlies culture. These aren't different worlds, they're connected. Now, I take great heart, coming back to the question of hope, from my students who have expressed such an interest to move beyond the Arctic as an enclosed space to understand more about how it's interconnected with other parts of the world. To do this doesn't mean learning less about the Arctic, rather it means listening more acutely to the people who live in the Arctic. So I just want to finish by saying that I think the key for all of us, including school children, is to hear more contemporary Northern voices. I would like to see more support for the work of Indigenous writers and publishers of those writers. Take, for example, Greenlandic poets such as Torklik Mørch, Gerda Fyrstedal, and Inunn Quoc Larsen, published beautifully in translation, by the way, by Newer American Press and the Crooning Wind, or Indigenous dancers like Tanya Kagak, or filmmakers like Zacharias Kunuk from Igloolik. I think all these people have a lot to say, both in terms of self-representation and their views of their own world. But the Arctic is not hermetically sealed. And I believe, as my colleagues on the panel will be able to say more about, they have a very big view of the world. So if one of the key questions of the Arctic is, forever we're coming back to the question about what makes our planet a habitable place, then we can be pretty confident that Northern peoples and their cultures will continue to be insightful and to play a major role in that conversation.